His coat was older than the town itself and held more secrets in its seams. It was the first thing they saw, a relic of indeterminate color, sun-bleached to the shade of dust, stained by rain and memory, hanging from the shoulders of the man who rode into Sovereign's jaw as if he were already a ghost. The heat of the high desert pressed down like a physical weight, silencing the song of the blacksmith's hammer and baking the raw timber of the saloon front until it smelled of pine sap and defeat. This was a silence that listened, a stillness that judged from behind twitching curtains and the dark voids of alleyways. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and the local time on your side of the prairie. It's always a joy to know how far these old tales travel. So let me tell you how a worn-out coat and a forgotten name brought a reckoning to a town that thought it knew the measure of a man. The stranger's horse, a lean buckskin with more bone than flesh, stopped before the water trough with a sigh that seemed to stir the dust across the entire street. The man didn't dismount immediately. His eyes, set deep within a face weathered like old leather, scanned the length of the town. It wasn't a casual glance. It was an assessment, a reading of the land and the structures built upon it. He noted the saloon, the gilded cage, with its bat-wing doors hanging slightly askew. He saw the marshal's office, a squat building of riverstone and grim authority, a single rifle leaning by the doorframe. He saw the general store, its windows displaying the same faded bolts of calico they'd probably shown a year ago. His gaze lingered for a moment on the formidable rock formation that gave the town its name, a massive, jutting cliff edge that looked like the jawbone of some long-dead god, perpetually open in a silent scream. When he finally swung his leg over the saddle, the movement was not that of a weary vagrant. It was fluid, economical, a motion born of 1,000 such dismounts in places far less forgiving than this. He landed with a soft thud of worn boot leather, his knees bending to absorb the impact, with a grace that went entirely unnoticed by the men who saw only his poverty. The coat, a Civil War greatcoat by the looks of it, though its original allegiance had long been scoured away by time and hardship, settled around him like a shroud. Its wool was thick and matted, patched at the elbow with a piece of canvas, and near the hem with what looked like tanned deerskin. It was a garment for a colder world, a walking history of blizzards and mountain passes, utterly out of place in the oven of this valley. Around the saloon porch, a cattle buyer named Finch, with a face flushed from whiskey, nudged his companion. "Look what the wind blew in," he muttered, loud enough to carry. "Smells like last winter's sorrows." The stranger gave no sign he'd heard. He led his horse to the trough, pulled the bit from its mouth with a gentle hand, and let the animal drink its fill. Every soul in Sovereign's jaw knew the unspoken code. A man was what he owned. A fine horse, a silver-buckled belt, a colt with an ivory handle. These were statements of worth. This man's possessions were his tired horse, the clothes on his back, and a saddle so worn it seemed to have fused with the animal's spine. To the town, he was a walking cipher of failure, a man whose story was already written and deemed unworthy of reading. It was a common frontier belief, a harsh but simple metric. Providence rewarded the righteous and the strong. This man, therefore, must be neither. He walked past the saloon, the laughter from within faltering as he passed the doors, his shadow falling momentarily across the floorboards. He didn't look in. His destination was the livery stable at the far end of the street, a cavernous structure that smelled of hay, manure, and the sweet decay of time. The owner, a stooped man named Jeb, leaned against a post, whittling a piece of wood into a pile of pale shavings. He watched the stranger approach, his eyes narrowed with the practiced suspicion of a man who'd seen too many drifters try to trade a lame story for a bale of hay. "Looking for something?" Jeb asked. His voice bowed. The stranger stopped a few feet away, keeping a respectful distance. "A place for my horse. Some water. I can pay." His voice was low and quiet, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a dry creek bed. It held no plea, no desperation. He reached into a pocket of his coat, the gesture slow and deliberate, and produced 2 bits, laying them on a nearby barrelhead. The coins were dull, worn smooth by countless transactions. Jeb stared at the money, then back at the man. The offer to pay was unexpected. The amount, pitiful. It wouldn't cover a full night's board and feed, not by a long shot. But it wasn't charity the man was asking for. It was a transaction, a matter of honor, however small. Jeb's gaze fell again to the coat. He'd seen coats like that before, on men stumbling back from the war 20 years ago. Men who carried the ghosts of Shiloh and Gettysburg in their eyes. This man had that same look, a profound and unshakable weariness that had nothing to do with the miles he'd just traveled. "Just for the night," the stranger clarified, his gaze steady. "He can stand in the corral. He won't be any trouble." Jeb grunted, a sound of reluctant acceptance. He scooped up the coins. "Corral's out back. There's a pump. Don't you be no trouble neither." The stranger nodded once, a gesture of silent agreement. He led his horse away, disappearing into the shadows of the livery. From the window of his office, Marshal Harding watched the entire exchange. He didn't see a vagrant. He saw a man who knew how to handle himself, a man who moved with a predator's quiet awareness. And he saw the coat, a garment so heavy, so laden with the dust of the entire continent, that he couldn't help but wonder what sins or sorrows it was meant to cover. Dawn broke over the stone jawbone, spilling weak yellow light into the street and chasing away the last of the night's chill. Silas was already awake, having spent the night not in the hayloft as Jeb might have expected, but sitting with his back against a corral post, his heavy coat drawn tight. He moved before the town truly stirred, pumping water for his horse, checking its hooves with a practiced eye, and using a handful of straw to wipe the dust from the animal's coat. These were the slow, deliberate rituals of a man whose only constant companion was the beast that carried him. He performed them with a quiet focus that sealed him off from the world, a small island of purpose in the vast emptiness of the high desert. When he was done, he folded his greatcoat with a strange reverence, laying it carefully over his saddle. It was too heavy, too hot to wear while seeking work. His first stop was the blacksmith's forge. The smith, a barrel-chested man named Cole, with arms like oak boughs, was already at work, his hammer falls ringing like a bell against the morning silence. The air thrummed with heat and the sharp, metallic scent of cooling iron. Silas waited until the smith had finished shaping a horseshoe, not interrupting the rhythm of the work. Cole plunged the glowing shoe into a quenching tub, the water hissing and exploding in a cloud of steam. He turned, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a leather-gloved hand. "What?" he grunted, his eyes immediately dismissive. He saw the patched shirt, the worn trousers, the look of a man without prospects. "Looking for a day's labor," Silas said, his voice even. "I can swing a sledge, split wood, anything you need." Cole scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "I need a man who knows his way around a forge, someone who won't turn my iron to slag." He looked at Silas's hands. They were calloused, yes, but not the thick, misshapen pads of a blacksmith. The calluses were in different places, suggesting a different kind of life, a different kind of tool. "You're no smith." It was not a question. It was a verdict. "No," Silas admitted. "But I can learn, or I can do the work you don't want to." For a moment, a flicker of something, perhaps grudging respect for the man's directness, crossed Cole's face. Then it was gone, replaced by the town's prevailing suspicion. He couldn't afford to take a chance on a drifter. Vagrants were notorious for working half a day, collecting their pay, and vanishing, sometimes with a tool or two from the shop. It was a common enough tale, part of the folklore of distrust that insulated towns like Sovereign's Jaw. "Got nothing for you," Cole said, turning back to his forge. The conversation declared over. Silas moved on. He tried the general store, where the proprietor's wife, a woman with a perpetually pinched face, needed crates of tinned goods moved from the storeroom. He did the work without a word, his movements efficient and strong. He stacked the heavy wooden boxes with a precision that hinted at a mind comfortable with order and logistics. She watched him the entire time, her arms crossed, as if expecting him to secret a can of peaches under his shirt. When he finished, she didn't offer coin. She handed him a small loaf of day-old bread and a shriveled apple. Silas looked at the offering, then at her. A flicker of some deep, hidden emotion passed through his eyes. A fire banked low, but his face remained a mask of calm neutrality. He nodded his thanks and left, the bread and apple feeling more like an insult than payment. He knew where his search would end. It was the place all desperate men eventually found their way to. The saloon. The gilded cage was livelier now, the morning drinkers already chasing away the shakes. Finch, the cattle buyer from the day before, was at the bar, holding court. The saloon owner, a portly man named Barlow, with a greasy apron stretched tight over his belly, was wiping down the counter. "Well, look here," Finch drawled as Silas stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. "The ghost is back. Find a gold mine out there in the livery, did you?" Laughter rippled through the few patrons. Silas ignored him, his attention on Barlow. "Heard you might have need of a swamper." Barlow stopped wiping, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked Silas up and down, a humiliatingly slow appraisal. The job of a swamper was the lowest of the low. It meant cleaning up the filth of other men, spilled whiskey, tobacco spit, and, worst of all, the overflowing spittoons and the reeking outhouse. It was work reserved for the town drunk or those too broken to feel shame. "You want to be my swamper?" Barlow asked, his voice laced with mock surprise. "It's hard work, dirty work, not for a man with any pride left." Here it was, the final stripping away of dignity. In the creed of the West, a man's pride was his spine. To willingly take a job that required none was to admit you were less than a man. It was a psychological ploy, a way to affirm the town's judgment of him. They expected him to refuse, to show a flicker of indignation that they could then mock. They wanted to see him break. Silas stood for a long moment in the quiet that followed. The men watched him, their smirks frozen in place. They saw a man being offered the ultimate humiliation. But from her window across the street, in the small office where she mixed tinctures and set bones, the town doctor, Ilara, saw something else. She saw a man of incredible stillness, a man whose patience seemed less like resignation and more like a coiled spring. She had seen that look before in men who had endured great pain, men who had learned to separate their body from their spirit, letting the world batter one while the other remained untouched. Finally, Silas gave a single, curt nod. "Show me where the buckets are." The laughter that followed was louder this time, harsher. It was the sound of relief, of confirmed prejudice. They had taken his measure, and he had come up short, just as they knew he would. He was exactly what his coat proclaimed him to be, a man with no pride, no future, nothing. As Silas picked up a mop and a bucket of foul-smelling water, he was aware of their eyes on his back. He let their scorn wash over him, as meaningless as the spilled beer on the floorboards. He was playing a different game, one whose rules they couldn't begin to comprehend. And for now, patience was his only move. The stench of stale beer and regret clung to Silas long after he'd emptied the last spittoon and mopped the final stain from the saloon floor. Barlow had tossed him a single greasy coin, not even half a day's fair wage, but Silas took it without comment. He didn't linger to buy a drink or a meal. Instead, he walked back toward the livery stable, the loaf of bread from the general store tucked under his arm. The sun was high now, beating down on the dusty street, and the townsfolk who saw him pass averted their eyes. He was no longer just a stranger. He was the swamper, a man who had accepted his place at the bottom of their rigid hierarchy. His submission had, paradoxically, made him even more of an outcast. As he neared the livery, he heard the sounds of a struggle, a horse's panicked whinny, the sharp crack of a rope snapping taut, and Jeb's voice, cursing in a low, frustrated growl. Inside the main corral stood a fine-looking sorrel mare, her coat the color of a burnished copper pot. But she was favoring her right foreleg, her eyes wide with pain and fear. Jeb stood a few feet away, holding a broken lead rope, his face a mask of angry impotence. "Get back, you devil!" he shouted, as the horse shied away, circling the corral with a pronounced limp. "Just let me look at the damn leg!" This was Jezebel, a horse Jeb had bought cheap from a traveler passing through. She was fast and strong, but possessed a notoriously volatile temperament. Now, with the injury, she was impossible. Every attempt to get near her was met with bared teeth or the threat of a powerful kick. Silas stopped at the corral fence, his presence going unnoticed for a moment. He watched the dance between man and animal. He saw the fear in the horse and the fury in the man, a cycle of escalating panic. From her small clinic window across the way, which overlooked the livery yard, Ilara also watched. She had been grinding herbs for a fever tincture, but the commotion had drawn her attention. She saw what Silas saw, a beautiful animal in agony, and a man making it worse with every move. Silas unlatched the gate and stepped inside the corral, closing it quietly behind him. "You, swamper! Get out of there!" Jeb barked, finally noticing him. "She'll kill you! Got no more sense than a bolt of lightning!" Silas didn't look at Jeb. His eyes were fixed on the mare. He didn't move toward her. He simply stood, perfectly still, about 20 feet away. He made no sudden gestures. He just breathed, slow and even. The mare continued to circle, snorting nervously, but her frantic energy began to subside in the face of his unnerving calm. It was a common belief among horsemen that a nervous animal could read the soul of a man, that it could smell fear or aggression from 100 paces. Silas smelled of neither. He smelled of trail dust and wood smoke, of a profound and unshakable quiet. He began to speak, his voice so low it was barely a murmur, a stark contrast to Jeb's shouting. It wasn't words, not really, just a soft, rhythmic sound, a gentle rumble that seemed to meet the horse on its own terms. "Easy now," he crooned, the sound carrying on the hot, dry air. "Easy, girl. No one's going to hurt you." Slowly, deliberately, he sank into a crouch, making himself smaller, less threatening. The mare watched him, her ears twitching, her nostrils flaring. She took a hesitant step toward him, then another. Ilara, from her window, leaned forward, captivated. She was a woman of science, of poultices and sutures, but what she was witnessing felt more like a form of magic. It defied logic. Silas remained motionless as the horse approached, until her muzzle was just inches from his shoulder. She breathed him in, her warm breath stirring his hair. Only then did he move, his hand rising with excruciating slowness, not toward her head, but toward her neck, where he began to stroke her, his fingers firm but gentle. He continued his low murmuring, a constant stream of reassurance. After a full minute of this, he shifted his attention, his hand moving down her shoulder, along her leg, with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime speaking this silent language. The horse trembled, but did not pull away. His fingers, those same hands that had cleaned the filth of the saloon, now probed the swollen tendon above her fetlock with diagnostic precision. Laura recognized the technique immediately. He was checking for heat, for the exact location of the strain. It was the work of a skilled veterinarian, not a common drifter. He found the spot. The mare flinched, but his other hand never stopped its calming motion, and his voice never wavered. He looked over his shoulder at the stunned livery owner. "You got any comfrey root?" he asked, his voice still quiet. "Sometimes called knit bone. Need to make a poultice. Cold water and burlap in the meantime, to keep the swelling down." Jeb could only stare, his mouth slightly agape. Comfrey was a folk remedy, but an effective one. To name it, to know its use for mending bone and sinew, was a sign of deep, practical knowledge. He finally broke from his stupor and hurried off to fetch the burlap, his earlier hostility completely forgotten, replaced by a sense of awe. Silas continued to soothe the horse, his head bowed close to hers, whispering things no one else could hear. Across the street, Ilara stood back from the window, her heart pounding with a strange mix of confusion and certainty. The town had judged this man by his coat and his willingness to perform a demeaning job. They saw a broken vagrant, but she had just seen something entirely different. She had seen a man with a rare and profound gift for healing, a gentleness that was the absolute antithesis of the violence and failure everyone else had projected onto him. The chasm between what the town saw and what she had just witnessed was immense, and in that gap, a dangerous and compelling question began to grow. It began as a low vibration in the soles of their feet, a distant tremor that the people of Sovereign's jaw recognized before they could even hear it. It was the afternoon stage, the town's bi-weekly artery to the rest of the world. Hammers fell silent. Conversations on the saloon porch trailed off. Windows and doorways filled with curious faces. The arrival of the Overland Stage Company's Concord coach was a communal ritual, a dusty, clamorous promise that they were not entirely forgotten by the civilization that lay beyond the mountain ranges. For a few brief moments, the town's own petty grievances and suspicions were eclipsed by a shared, almost desperate, anticipation for news. From her clinic, Ilara watched the street begin to fill, but her mind was still in the livery corral. She could still see the quiet authority in the stranger's hands, the way the frantic mare had submitted to his calm. Jeb was now excitedly telling anyone who would listen how the drifter had practically charmed the horse, his story growing with each telling. Yet no one seemed to connect the swamper from the saloon with the horse healer from the stable. To them, they were two different men, the cognitive dissonance too great to overcome. Silas, however, seemed utterly indifferent to the growing commotion. He had finished applying a cold poultice to Jezebel's leg, fashioning a wrap from burlap and drenched strips of cloth with meticulous care. Now he simply stood with the animal in the shade of the livery's overhang, his hand resting on her neck, keeping her calm. He heard the rumble grow to a roar, saw the plume of dust rising like a signal fire in the distance, but his expression remained unchanged. He was a man accustomed to waiting, and this noisy interruption was no different from a sudden dust storm or a clap of thunder. It was simply a thing to be endured until it passed. Then it burst into view. The coach, a magnificent wreck of red paint and trail dust, swayed violently on its leather thoroughbraces, drawn by 4 exhausted horses, whose coats were dark with sweat. The driver, a leathery man named Gus with a whip-thin frame, sawed on the reins, shouting curses and praise at his team in equal measure. Beside him, a shotgun messenger sat stoically, his weapon held across his lap, his eyes scanning the rooftops, a testament to the fact that every stagecoach was a rolling repository of things worth killing for: payrolls, secrets, and, most importantly, mail. With a final lurch and a groan of stressed timber, the coach shuddered to a halt in front of the marshal's office. Gus threw the brake lever and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Sovereign's jaw!" he bellowed, his voice raw. "End of the line for some. Hell's front porch for the rest." The town crowded closer, a wave of humanity drawn to this nexus of information. A single, weary-looking passenger in a rumpled suit stepped out, blinking in the harsh sunlight. Men began unloading a few meager crates for the general store. But all eyes of any importance were on the leather mail pouch that the shotgun guard handed down to Marshal Harding. Harding took the pouch with a practiced solemnity. It was heavier than usual. He could feel the dense, rectangular shape of the official packet inside, nestled amongst the personal letters and newspapers. This was the part of his job that always set his teeth on edge. The posters. They were his eyes and ears beyond the valley, printed warnings of the wolves that might be heading for his flock. He gave Gus a nod, a silent acknowledgement between 2 men who understood the burdens of their posts, and turned toward his office. The crowd began to buzz, the speculation flowing as freely as whiskey later would. "Heard they're still after that Blackheart gang," one man offered to Cole, the blacksmith. "Hit a bank up in the territory." Finch, the cattle buyer, swaggered over. "More likely it's about that railroad payroll. The Pinkertons have put up a reward that could buy this whole sorry town." Their talk was of legendary phantoms, of half-mythical figures whose violent exploits were told and retold around campfires. The names were big, the crimes audacious. It was a form of entertainment, a way to feel connected to the grand, bloody sweep of history being written across the plains. The idea that true danger could be standing silently less than 100 yards away, tending to a lame horse, was beyond the scope of their imagination. Danger, in their minds, always arrived with the thunder of a dozen horses, not the whisper of a man in a tattered coat. Inside his office, Marshal Harding untied the leather thongs of the mail pouch. The air was stuffy, smelling of stale coffee and old paper. He sorted through the contents: a letter for Ilara, likely from a medical supplier back east, a catalog for the general store, a newspaper from Cheyenne, already 2 weeks old. And at the bottom, the thing he was waiting for. It was a thick packet, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements. Official business. He placed it squarely in the center of his desk, its weight seeming to anchor the room in a new and potent gravity. He stared at it for a long moment, the excited chatter of the town filtering through his open window. He knew that once he opened that packet, the fragile peace of his day, and perhaps his town, would be over. With a sigh, he broke the wax seal. The first few posters from the oilcloth packet were mundane, a gallery of desperate men whose crimes were as small as their rewards. A cattle rustler worth $50, a card-sharp wanted for skipping bail in a neighboring county. Marshal Harding scanned them with a practiced, weary eye, the faces and names blurring into a familiar litany of frontierisry. He was about to stack them away for later when his thumb caught on the last one. It was printed on thicker stock, the ink blacker, the authority behind it feeling heavier, colder. The woodcut illustration was crude, as they all were, showing a man with hollow eyes and a gaunt face, a generic sketch that could have been any number of hard-luck travelers. But it was the number at the top that made Harding's breath catch in his throat. $5,000. It was a staggering sum, the kind of money that turned honest men into backshooters and neighbors into informants. It was a king's ransom, enough to buy a sprawling ranch or to vanish and start a new life entirely. This was not a local matter. This was federal. His eyes scanned the text, his heart beginning a low, heavy drum against his ribs. Wanted, dead or alive, for his role in the robbery of the Rock Island Line, payroll train near the Cimarron River crossing. Harding leaned back in his chair, the worn wood creaking in the stillness of his office. The Rock Island heist had been news for months, a bold and bloody affair that had left 3 guards dead. It was the work of a professional, well-organized gang. He forced himself to read the description, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. Subject is approximately 6 feet in height, spare of build. Hair is brown, eyes are gray. Tends toward a quiet, watchful disposition. May possess skills related to animal husbandry. Last seen moving west, believed to be alone. Is known to wear a faded, patched Union Army greatcoat. The last line hit him like a physical blow. Harding slowly lifted his gaze and looked out his window, across the street toward the livery. He could just make out the figure of the stranger, still standing with the sorrel mare, a silhouette of quiet patience against the deepening afternoon shadows. The horse healer, the swamper, the man whose quiet disposition had been mistaken for weakness, the man whose hands held a healer's gentleness, the cultural belief that a man's evil was written on his face, that a killer would carry himself with a swagger or a sneer, crumbled to dust. Danger had arrived not like a thunderstorm, but like a fog, silent and unnoticed until the whole world was enveloped. A name. He needed the name. Jeb. The livery owner would know. Harding felt a surge of adrenaline, a frantic need to confirm the impossible. He stood so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. He was halfway to the door when he stopped, his hand on the frame. What would he do? March across the street and arrest him? With what posse? It was just him and a town full of farmers and shopkeepers, none of them gun hands. An arrest attempt on a man this desperate, with a bounty this high on his head, would be a bloodbath. He needed to be certain. He needed to control the situation. He waited until dusk, the longest few hours of his life. He watched as the stranger, Silas, finished his work and led the now calm mare into a stall. He saw Jeb clap the man on the shoulder, a gesture of genuine gratitude that seemed horribly, terrifyingly naive. Later that evening, the saloon was buzzing, fueled by the gossip from the stagecoach's arrival and the free-flowing whiskey. The main topic of amusement had, inevitably, circled back to the town's newest resident. "Can you believe Barlow hired that tramp?" Finch sneered, his voice carrying over the din. "I wouldn't trust him to clean my boots, let alone my saloon." Cole, the blacksmith, grunted in agreement. "Jeb says he's some kind of horse whisperer. I say he's a common vagrant. A man finds his level. His is the muck on the floor." The men around them laughed, a cruel, braying sound. It was the laughter of men who, by mocking another's low station, felt they were elevating their own. It was the comfortable, thoughtless cruelty of a pack. The batwing doors swung open, and the laughter died in their throats. Marshal Harding stood there, his face set like granite. The air in the room became thick, heavy. He didn't say a word. He walked through the silent crowd, his spurs ringing softly on the floorboards. In his hand, he held the poster. He moved to the notice board, a chaotic mess of curling papers and announcements, and with 4 decisive movements, he tacked the thick new sheet over top of everything else. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the faces of the men in the room, watching them. The poster, with its stark headline and shocking number, dominated the board. Finch, ever the center of attention, puffed out his chest and stepped forward to read it aloud, his voice booming with self-importance. "Wanted dead or alive! $5,000! A collective gasp went through the room. Men leaned in closer. "For robbery of the Rock Island line!" Finch's voice faltered for a moment as he squinted at the name, the looping script unfamiliar. He sounded it out slowly. "Wanted. A man by the name of Silas Kane." The name fell into the room like a stone into a deep well. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. The men looked at each other, their faces pale in the lantern light. The jokes, the scorn, the easy laughter, it all evaporated, replaced by a cold, primal fear. It was Jeb, who had just come in for a drink, who gave voice to the terror. His face was ashen. "Silas," he whispered, the name a ragged breath. "The drifter. He told me his name was Silas." All eyes shot to the poster, to the crude drawing that had seemed so generic only a moment before. Now they could see it. They superimposed the stranger's quiet face, his gray eyes, his worn coat onto the sketch. They weren't laughing anymore. They were locked in a room, in a town, with a man whose life was worth a fortune, and whose death was worth just as much. The silence in the saloon was so absolute that when a whiskey glass slipped from some trembling hand and shattered on the floorboards, the sound was like a gunshot. Every man flinched. The air, thick with the smell of cheap liquor and sawdust only moments before, now tasted of pure, metallic fear. The men who had laughed the loudest now seemed the most terrified, their faces slack with shock. The crude drawing on the poster no longer looked generic. It looked like a death sentence, not just for the man named Silas Kane, but for any town unlucky enough to be his hiding place. Finch, the cattle buyer whose booming voice had led the mockery, was the first to find his tongue. His face, usually ruddy with drink, was a pale, doughy mask. "He's at the livery," he whispered, the words meant for the man next to him, but carrying through the entire silent room. "Just sitting out there." The whisper broke the spell. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a contagion of fear and a dawning, terrible avarice. $5,000. Men looked at their own calloused hands, at the worn floorboards of the saloon, at a life of breaking their backs for a few dollars a month. That number was an abstraction, a myth. To have it here, within reach, embodied in the form of the quiet drifter they'd scorned, was an idea so powerful it bordered on madness. "There's one of him," Cole the blacksmith said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't whispering. He was thinking aloud, the gears of a practical, violent mind beginning to turn. And a dozen able-bodied men in this room. That was the spark. Finch seized on it, his fear transmuting into a dangerous, blustering bravado. "Cole's right!" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "We can't wait for some federal posse. Every bounty hunter and outlaw from here to the territory line will be on their way. You think they'll knock politely? They'll tear this town apart to get to him. We have to take him ourselves." A man in the back yelled, "He's right! It's our bounty! We take him alive. We split the money." Finch's eyes were wild now, lit with the fever of greed. We protect our town and we get rich doing it. This was the birth of a vigilance committee. The moment a group of frightened citizens decides that the law is too slow or too weak, that their fear gives them the right to wield rope and bullet. Hands began to drift toward the pistols holstered at their belts. Men who had never fired a gun in anger were suddenly imagining themselves heroes, their share of the reward already being spent in their minds. They saw themselves as the town's saviors, a classic frontier myth, but the reality was the formation of a lynch mob, plain and simple. Everybody stand down. Marshal Harding's voice cut through the rising clamor. It wasn't loud, but it carried an unmistakable weight of command that stopped the men in their tracks. He hadn't moved from his spot near the notice board, but his presence seemed to fill the room. "Stand down, Marshal," Finch spat, emboldened by the support behind him. "There's a killer in our midst and a fortune on his head. It's our duty to act. Your only duty right now is to stay put and not get yourselves killed," Harding said, his eyes moving from Finch to Cole, then to the other tense faces in the room. "You think a man with a $5,000 bounty on his head is some greenhorn you can corner with pitchforks? He's a professional. He's survived this long for a reason. You go out there, half-cocked and drunk, and he'll put you in the ground before you can clear leather. You'll be shooting at shadows, and your stray bullets will find their way into the homes of your neighbors." He let his words sink in, painting a picture not of glory, but of bloody, chaotic incompetence. He was appealing to the one thing that might overcome their greed, their cowardice. "This is my warrant," Harding continued, his voice hardening. He tapped a finger on the poster. "That makes him my prisoner. I'm going to go and arrest him, and I'm going to do it my way. Clean. Quiet, no crossfire." "You're going alone?" Cole asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Marshal, that's suicide." "It's better than a massacre," Harding countered. "Barlow," he said, turning to the saloon owner who was hiding behind his bar. "Lock these doors. Nobody goes in or out until I get back. Anybody tries to leave, you know what to do." He didn't need to elaborate. In his office, Harding had a rack of rifles, and every man knew it. He was placing the entire saloon under temporary arrest. He turned and walked toward the doors, the crowd parting before him like water. He didn't look back. As the bat-wing doors swung shut behind him, he heard the heavy sound of the crossbar being dropped into place. The men, their violent ambitions momentarily thwarted, were now his prisoners, their faces appearing as pale ovals in the saloon's windows. They watched him, their eyes full of resentment and fear. Harding stood alone in the street. The night was dark, the moon hidden by a scrim of high clouds. The wind whispered through the alleys, carrying the scent of dust and the faint, metallic smell of impending violence. He had to face Silas Kane. He had to protect the town from the outlaw, but he also knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just protected the outlaw from the town. He drew his Colt, the sound of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the silence, and started the long walk toward the livery stable. The walk from the saloon to the livery stable was the longest 100 yards of Marshal Harding's life. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep in a dark alley, every creak of a distant porch swing like the cocking of a hammer. Behind him, the locked-down saloon was a cage of simmering violence he had temporarily contained. Ahead lay the unknown. He moved in the shadows, his Colt feeling both heavy and inadequate in his hand. He was expecting an ambush, a desperate, final stand. Frontier lore was filled with tales of cornered outlaws who chose to go down in a blaze of gunfire rather than face the end of a rope. A man worth $5,000 would surely have such a battle planned. He reached the cavernous opening of the livery, the familiar scent of hay and horseflesh now tinged with the metallic taste of his own fear. A single lantern cast a pool of flickering golden light in the center of the stable, creating a stark island of visibility in the overwhelming dark. And there, sitting on an overturned crate just inside the light, was Silas Kane. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't armed and waiting. His back was to the entrance, his attention seemingly on the sorrel mare in the nearby stall. His greatcoat was folded neatly on the ground beside him. He looked, for all the world, like a simple stable hand enjoying a moment of peace after a long day's work. Harding raised his pistol, the barrel steady despite the frantic pounding of his heart. "Silas Kane," his voice, though quiet, seemed to boom in the enclosed space. Silas didn't jump. He didn't spin around. His shoulders sagged with a sigh, a sound of profound and infinite weariness. He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes finding the marshal in the darkness. He saw the gun pointed at his chest, and his expression was not of fear, but of grim resignation, as if he were greeting an old, unwelcome acquaintance. "Marshal," he acknowledged, his voice low and even. He made no move. "Stand up. Slowly," Harding commanded, stepping into the lantern light. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Silas complied. He rose to his feet with that same fluid economy of motion Harding had noted before, his hands held open at his sides. There was no defiance in his posture, no hint of a threat. It was a surrender so complete, so anticlimactic, that it felt profoundly wrong. It threw Harding completely off balance. This wasn't the behavior of a hardened killer from the Rock Island heist. "Turn around," Harding ordered, the handcuffs ready. As Silas turned, his gaze fell on the sorrel mare, who stirred nervously in her stall. "Marshal," he said, his voice calm, "tell Jeb to keep that poultice wet and cold. If the heat gets back in the tendon, she'll be lame for good." Harding froze for a second, the handcuffs hovering in midair. He was in the middle of arresting one of the most wanted men in the territory, and the man's primary concern was for the welfare of a horse he'd met that morning. The dissonance was staggering. It was a detail so human, so compassionate, that it warred violently with the cold, hard facts printed on the poster in his office. He roughly snapped the cuffs onto Silas's wrists, the metallic click echoing in the stable. "Let's go." The walk back to the jail was a parade of one, conducted under the burning eyes of the men trapped in the saloon. They saw the marshal, a grim silhouette, and the tall, cuffed figure of the man who was worth a fortune. They saw a peaceful arrest, not the bloody shootout they had craved and feared. The jail was a simple, formidable building, an office in the front, 2 cells in the back. The cells were the town's one great expenditure, ordered from a catalog from a firm in St. Louis. The doors were strap steel, cross-riveted, and impervious to any tool a prisoner might find. Harding shoved Silas into the cell on the right. The heavy door slammed shut with a deafening clang of finality, a sound that declared the supremacy of the law. The lock turning in the tumbler was the final punctuation mark. Silas paid the noise no mind. He simply walked to the simple cot, sat down, and looked at the marshal through the bars. Harding hung the key on a hook by his desk, then sank into his own chair, the exhaustion of the last hour washing over him. He stared at his prisoner, the man on the poster, the man who healed horses and surrendered without a word. The 2 images refused to merge. "I have to ask," Harding said, his voice raspy. "I've been a lawman for 20 years. I've arrested dozens of men. None of them, especially not one with a price like yours on his head, has ever come along so quietly. You could have run. You could have fought. Why didn't you, Kane?" Silas looked at his cuffed hands, then back up at the marshal. A long moment of silence passed between them, stretching until it was taut with unspoken questions. He didn't offer a denial or a proclamation of innocence. He offered something far more unsettling. "Because I'm tired of running, Marshal," he said, his voice devoid of self-pity. "And some things you can't outrun. They follow you, so you might as well turn around and face them when they arrive." He paused, his gray eyes holding Harding's gaze. "Besides, from the looks of those men in the saloon, this jail cell is the safest place in Sovereign's jaw for me tonight." The statement was so logical, so devoid of the panic or rage Harding expected, that it left him speechless. It suggested that this surrender wasn't an act of submission, but a calculated, tactical decision. The marshal looked at the poster on his desk, then back at the calm, intelligent man in the cell. For the first time, he felt a sliver of doubt, a deep and troubling sense that the poster on his desk, for all its official ink and bold pronouncements, did not tell the whole story. For nearly an hour, the only sounds in the jailhouse were the weary ticking of the clock on the wall and the low murmur of the wind outside. Marshal Harding sat at his desk, the damning poster laid out before him, a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. He'd left the lantern burning low, casting long shadows that made the room feel like a tomb. In the cell, Silas sat on the edge of the cot, a figure of unnerving stillness. He hadn't paced, hadn't tested the bars, hadn't cursed his fate. He simply sat, as if in quiet contemplation. The silence was a standoff, a psychological battle in which the prisoner seemed to hold all the power. Then came a sharp, deliberate knock on the front door. Harding was on his feet in an instant, his hand reflexively going to his Colt. His first thought was the mob from the saloon. He'd known their thirst for blood money wouldn't be slaked by a locked door for long. He moved to the door, peering through the small barred window beside it. He saw not a mob, but a single figure holding a lantern, the light illuminating a familiar, determined face. It was Alara, the town doctor, her medical bag clutched in her other hand. He slid the bolt back and opened the door a crack, blocking the entrance with his body. "Alara, what in God's name are you doing out here? The whole town's about to boil over." "That's why I'm here, Marshal," she said, her voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the tension vibrating through the town. She didn't try to push past him. She met his suspicious gaze directly. "I heard you made the arrest." "I did. And the prisoner is secure. You should be at home, with your door locked." "A man worth $5,000 isn't a prisoner, Marshal. He's an asset," she stated, her tone pragmatic and professional. "An asset that needs to be delivered to the federal authorities alive, and, preferably, healthy. A prisoner who dies of a festering wound or a fever is worthless. It would be a black mark on your record and a significant financial loss for this town." Harding was taken aback by her cold, clinical logic. He'd been expecting a plea, perhaps, or a horrified curiosity. Instead, she presented him with an argument rooted in his own sense of duty and the town's avarice. It was an unassailable point. "He came in peacefully," Harding said, his tone softening slightly. "He's not hurt. You and I both know that men like that can live with injuries that would kill a farmer," she countered. "He could have old wounds. He could be sick from the trail. It is my duty as this town's physician to assess his condition. Let me see him. It will all be official. For your report." She was giving him a perfectly defensible reason, an excuse to allow an act of compassion that he himself was struggling with. The cultural authority of a doctor, especially one as respected as Alara, was one of the few forces that could stand against mob rule. He hesitated for a moment longer, then stepped back, allowing her to enter the charged atmosphere of the jail. Alara's presence immediately changed the room's dynamic. Where there had been a stark, masculine tension between lawman and outlaw, her arrival introduced a quiet, civilizing force. She walked past Harding's desk, her eyes falling on the wanted poster. She scanned the description, her expression unreadable, then turned her attention to the man in the cell. Silas watched her approach, his guard clearly up. He had seen her earlier, watching from her window. He didn't know if she was here out of fear, curiosity, or some other motive he couldn't guess. Ilara stopped a few feet from the bars. She wasn't carrying just her medical bag. Harding now saw she had a small tray with a clean cloth over it. "I'm Ilara," she said simply, her voice soft but clear. "I'm the doctor here. I've brought you some food and water." She placed her bag on the floor and set the tray down, sliding it carefully under the bars. On it was a thick slice of bread, a piece of smoked jerky, and a tin cup of fresh water. It was a simple meal, but it was an offering of dignity. "The marshal tells me you weren't injured during your arrest," she continued, her eyes studying him intently. She wasn't just looking at him. She was observing him, the way she observed a patient for signs of fever or distress. She saw the same profound stillness she'd seen when he was calming the horse. There was no malice in his eyes, only a deep, weary caution. Silas looked from her face to the tray of food. It was likely the first act of unconditional kindness he'd received in months, maybe years. He remained silent, assessing her. "I saw what you did for Jeb's mare this afternoon," Ilara said quietly, and this got a reaction, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. That was a kindness she desperately needed. "I thought I might offer one in return." She was offering him a reason to trust her, connecting her actions to his. She had seen beyond the coat, beyond the job. Cleaning the saloon. She had seen an act of character and was now responding in kind. This was the moment the first thread of trust was forged. Slowly, Silas knelt down. His movements were deliberate as he reached for the tray. For a brief second, his fingers brushed against hers as he took it. He looked up at her, and the guarded mask fell away for just an instant, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath. It was a look of raw, stunning gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You should eat," Ilara said, rising to her feet. She turned to the marshal, who had watched the entire exchange with a mixture of suspicion and awe. "He seems fine for now, Marshal, but it would be wise to let him rest." She picked up her bag and walked to the door. Harding followed, his mind reeling. He locked the door behind her and turned back to the cell. Silas had already taken a bite of the bread, a simple, human act that somehow made the monstrous bounty on his head seem all the more absurd. Harding looked at his prisoner, then at the poster, then back again. Ilara was right. The poster was missing a few important details, and he had a sinking feeling they were the only details that truly mattered. The bread was coarse, but it was real. The water was cool, and it washed away the dust of his capture. But as Silas sat on the cot in the suffocating silence of the jail, it wasn't the taste of the food that filled his senses. It was the low, rhythmic rumble of a train, a ghost sound from 6 months ago, echoing in the landscape of his memory. The ticking of the marshal's clock faded away, replaced by the clatter of steel wheels on a track stretching across the infinite plains of the Cimarron. He wasn't in a cell. He was crouched in a dry arroyo, the sun hot on his back, his face younger, leaner, and etched with a desperate kind of hope. Beside him, Elias Thorne checked the fuse on a bundle of dynamite, his movements quick and precise. Thorne was a man of dazzling charisma, with a smile that could charm a snake and eyes as cold and calculating as a winter river. They had served together in the war, and it was Thorne's silver tongue that had painted their current venture not as a crime, but as righteous justice. "It's not stealing, Silas," Thorne had said a week before, his voice a conspiratorial whisper over a campfire. "The Rock Island Line, backed by their robber baron friends in Chicago, cheated my father out of his land. They cheated your family out of that freight contract. This isn't theft, It's restitution. We are taking back what is owed. Silas had believed him, or had wanted to. He saw the heist as a single, decisive act that would give him the means to buy a small ranch, to build a life of peace far from the memories of war and poverty. He wasn't a thief in his heart. He was a man looking for an escape hatch from a life of slow decline. He failed to see that for Thorne, greed was not a means to an end. It was the end itself. The myth of the outlaw's code, of honor among thieves, was a story Thorne told to manipulate the loyalties of better men. The ground began to vibrate. The train was coming. "Remember the plan," Thorne said, his smile electric with adrenaline. "We derail the mail car, blow the safe, take the payroll. No one gets hurt. We're ghosts, in and out before they even know what happened." Silas nodded, his heart pounding. The plan was clean, bloodless. That was the only reason he'd agreed. The explosion was deafening, a geyser of dirt and splintered timber erupting from the tracks. The train shrieked in a torturous protest of metal on metal, lurching to a halt exactly where they'd planned. They moved like lightning, masks over their faces, storming the mail car. 2 guards were inside, their faces pale with shock. One was an old man, the other barely a boy. "Just do as you're told, and you'll live to see supper," Silas shouted, his voice rough with manufactured authority. But Thorne was on a different plane of existence. His eyes were alight with a terrifying fire. When the older guard made a hesitant move toward a holstered pistol, Thorne's gun was already out. The shot was so loud in the enclosed car, it left Silas's ears ringing. The old man crumpled to the floor. The boy stared, his mouth open in a silent scream, and Thorne shot him, too. "No witnesses, Silas," Thorne hissed, the smoke curling from his barrel. "It's the only way to be sure. This wasn't in the plan," Silas yelled back, his stomach churning with horror and the bitter taste of self-loathing. He had trusted this man. He had let this man's ambition lead him here, to this moment of senseless slaughter. "Plans change," Thorne retorted, already working on the safe with a crowbar. The rest was a blur of violence and adrenaline. They blew the safe and stuffed the heavy canvas bags with banknotes. They fled on horseback, leaving the dead and the dying in a cloud of dust and steam. They rode hard for half a day, to a hidden canyon where they'd stashed supplies. It was there, as the sun began to set, that the final betrayal unfolded. Silas was cleaning the wound from a stray splinter of wood, his mind reeling from the bloodshed. The money bags lay on the ground, a pile of paper and ink that now felt cursed. "We did it, my friend," Thorne said, his voice strangely calm. He was cleaning his pistol, polishing the barrel with a rag. "A new life awaits." "This isn't the life I wanted, Elias," Silas said, his voice hollow. "Those men, they were no threat to us." Thorne stopped polishing his gun. He looked up, and his charming smile was gone. In its place was a look of chilling pity. "That's always been your problem, Silas. You have a conscience. It's like an anchor. It holds a man down. I, on the other hand, have learned to travel light." Before Silas could react, Thorne raised his pistol. "The story will be simple. Silas Kane, a disgruntled war veteran, led a gang that robbed the Rock Island train and killed 2 guards. The gang turned on each other, and Kane made off with the money. A villain, a monster. But me? No one will ever know my name." The gunshot echoed through the canyon. The bullet tore through Silas's side, a searing, white-hot pain that threw him back against the rock wall. He slid to the ground, the world tilting and fading to gray. The last thing he saw was Elias Thorne, his face impassive, loading all the money bags onto his horse. He looked down at Silas, a ghost already fading into the twilight. $5,000, Thorne mused aloud. "They'll put quite a price on your head. You've just become a legend, old friend. He rode away without a backward glance, leaving Silas to bleed out in the dust. A scapegoat for a crime he tried to prevent. A ghost on the open plains, long before his heart had stopped beating. The vision faded. Silas was back in the cell. The ticking of the clock returned. He looked down at the half-eaten piece of bread in his hand. A small, tangible anchor to a present that was built entirely on the ruins of that single, catastrophic day. The new day dawned on a town holding its breath. Marshal Harding had let the men out of the saloon at sunrise, and they'd dispersed into the quiet streets, not with the bravado of the previous night, but with a sullen, resentful silence. The bounty fever had broken, replaced by the cold reality of their situation. They were a small, isolated town, and they had a $5,000 problem locked in their jail. Every man who passed the marshal's office glanced at the building with a mixture of fear and proprietary anger, as if Silas Kane were a treasure they both owned and were terrified of guarding. Harding was nursing his third cup of coffee, watching the street through his window, when a boy playing with a wooden hoop at the edge of town suddenly stopped and pointed. A small dust cloud was rising from the east, too small for a stagecoach, too deliberate for a stray cattle drive. It was riders, 2 of them, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. A knot tightened in the marshal's stomach. He reached for the old brass spyglass he kept on his desk, the one he normally used for tracking lost livestock or spotting incoming storms. He propped it on the window frame, the glass cool against his skin, and twisted the focus ring. The distant figures swam into sharp relief. They were not lawmen. There were no federal insignias, no uniforms. They were not cowboys either. They were dressed in dark, practical clothing, their hats pulled low. They rode with a grim economy of motion, their backs straight, their bodies moving as one with their horses. Each man had a long-barreled rifle in a saddle scabbard, something heavy and powerful looking like a Sharps, a buffalo gun capable of killing at 1,000 yards. These were not men who had come to talk. They were professionals. From her clinic window, Ilara saw them too. She had spent a sleepless night, her thoughts replaying the moment of quiet dignity in the jail cell. Seeing the 2 riders approach, her first instinct was a flash of hope, a real posse perhaps, come to take Silas away and end this ordeal. But as she watched them, a sense of dread replaced her hope. Like the marshal, she saw their cold, predatory purpose. The riders did not take the main road into Sovereign's Jaw. In a move that sent a chill down Harding's spine, they veered south, taking a narrow, winding trail that led up the side of the valley toward the stone jawbone formation that loomed over the town. They were taking the high ground. It was a calculated military maneuver. They weren't coming to knock on his door and present a warrant. They were setting up a field of fire. Inside his cell, Silas couldn't see the riders, but he could feel the change in the atmosphere as surely as an animal senses a shift in the wind. The low murmur of the town had ceased. There was a new quality to the silence, a tense, watchful stillness. He saw the grim set of the marshal's jaw as he lowered the spyglass. "What is it?" Silas asked. His voice calm. "Riders," Harding said, not taking his eyes off the ridge. 2 of them, taking up a position on the cliffs. Silas's face, which had remained a mask of stoic calm since his arrest, hardened. A flicker of the ghost he'd been on the plains, the man left for dead, returned to his eyes. He rose from his cot and walked to the bars, his gaze fixed on the marshal. "What do they look like?" "They're not lawmen," Harding admitted, his voice low. "Dressed dark, heavily armed. They look like hunters." The word hung in the air between them. Silas gripped the cold steel of the bars, his knuckles white. The false hope that turning himself in might lead to a trial, A chance to speak his truth evaporated in an instant. He had known this was a possibility, a likelihood even, but the reality of it was a cold weight in his gut. Thorne was not a man to leave loose ends. "They're not bounty hunters, Marshal," Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, imbued with a chilling certainty. "Not the kind that want to bring me in for a reward. They're here to make sure the full story of the Rock Island job dies with me." Harding turned from the window to face him fully. The man in the cell was no longer just his prisoner. The poster on his desk suddenly seemed irrelevant, a piece of paper in a deadly game whose rules were being written on the cliffsides above them. He was now caught between two distinct, terrifying threats: the simmering mob in his own town and the cold, professional killers on the ridge. "That's Thorne's work," Silas continued, his voice flat and hard. "His name is Elias Thorne. He was my partner. He fired the shots that killed those guards, and he put the bullet in my back that left me for dead. He won't risk me ever telling that to a judge." He looked Harding square in the eye, the truth of his statement resonating in the tense silence. "Those men aren't here to capture Silas Kane, the notorious outlaw. They're here to execute Silas Kane, the only witness, and they will kill anyone who stands in their way. Your town, your people, they're now in the middle of it." The marshal looked back toward the ridge, where the two riders were now just tiny black specks against the rock, invisible to the naked eye, but holding the entire town hostage. The man in his jail cell was a wanted murderer, but he might also be the only person in Sovereign's jaw who knew how to fight the evil that had just arrived. The morning's tense quiet was not broken. It was obliterated. The sound came from the ridge, a single, tremendous crack that was deeper and sharper than any hunting rifle. It was the voice of a buffalo gun, a sound of immense power that rolled across the valley an instant before its consequence arrived. A high-pitched whistle sliced the air, ending with a deafening thwump as a fist-sized chunk of wood exploded from the side of the town's water tower. A plume of water erupted from the hole, a lifeblood artery severed, gushing onto the dusty ground below. For a heartbeat, the town was frozen in disbelief. That water tower was their shield against drought and fire. To see it so easily violated was to witness the impossible. Then the panic began. A second shot cracked from the ridge. This one struck the street just in front of the marshal's office, kicking up a violent spray of dirt and rock that peppered the building's facade. The illusion of safety, the cultural myth that a town's walls provided sanctuary, was shattered. The street, which had been populated by sullen, watchful men, became a scene of pure animal terror. Men who had, just the night before, been boasting of their intent to capture Silas Kane now scrambled for their lives, their bravado vanishing like smoke. Finch, the cattle buyer, let out a yelp and dove behind a horse trough, trying to make his large frame as small as possible. Cole, the blacksmith, managed to grab an old hunting rifle from his shop, but as he poked his head out, a third bullet splintered the doorframe inches from his face, sending him scrambling back into the darkness of his forge. They were utterly, hopelessly outmatched. These were not the quick-draw duels of saloon legends. This was a cold, impersonal, long-range execution. Marshal Harding was pinned down in his own office, crouched below the window line as another round punched through the wall above his head, showering his desk with splinters and plaster dust. He was a lawman, skilled in close-quarters disputes and facing down drunks. He was not a soldier prepared for a siege. He could hear the screams outside, the chaos he was powerless to stop. The professional killers on the ridge weren't just shooting. They were performing a calculated dissection of the town's morale. Another shot took out the main lantern hanging from the porch of the general store, showering the steps in shattered glass. A fifth pulverized the sign of the Gilded Cage Saloon, blasting the gilded letters into unrecognizable scraps of wood. They were demonstrating their reach, their accuracy, their absolute control. They could touch anything, destroy anything, at will. They were turning the familiar landscape of the town into a killing field. In the midst of the chaos, one place was an island of eerie calm, the jail cell. Silas stood at the bars, his back straight, his head cocked as he listened to the rhythm of the attack. He was not panicked. He was analytical. He'd heard these sounds before, in the chaos of a battlefield skirmish where death could come from an unseen enemy half a mile away. "They're using Sharp's rifles," he called out to the marshal, his voice cutting through the noise of Harding's own frantic thoughts. "Big .50 caliber. It'll go through both walls of this building if they get the angle right. Staying put is a death sentence." Harding, sweating and breathing heavily, looked from the splintered hole in his wall to the composed figure in the cell. "What do you want me to do, Kane? Go out there and wave a white flag?" "They don't want a flag," Silas said, his voice grim. "They're penning the herd. This isn't the main attack. This is a demonstration. They're showing you they can hit whatever they want, whenever they want. They're taking out your water, your cover, your courage. They want you to panic." From her clinic, Ilara was dragging a frightened woman and her child inside, her face a mask of determined courage. Her small building was quickly becoming a sanctuary for the wounded and the terrified. She was a healer, and she would act her part, even as the world outside was being torn apart. Just as suddenly as it began, the shooting stopped. The silence that descended was more terrifying than the noise. It was filled with the gushing of the dying water tower, the whimpering of a wounded horse, and the choked sobs of Finch, still hiding behind the trough. The message had been delivered with brutal efficiency. Marshal Harding slowly rose to his feet, peering cautiously over the windowsill at the ridge. He could see nothing but rock and sky. The hunters were invisible, godlike in their perch. He felt a wave of hopeless fury. His town was being held hostage, and his badge, his gun, his authority, they were all meaningless against an enemy he couldn't see. He turned and looked at Silas, whose calm, knowing eyes seemed to see right through him. "They want you to get scared enough," Silas said, finishing his thought. "Scared enough to do their job for them. They want you to drag me out into the street and hand me over." The implication was clear. The town's only hope for survival might be to protect the very man they had been ready to lynch just hours before. The outlaw in the cell was no longer the greatest threat to Sovereign's jaw. The true monsters were on the ridge. In the eerie silence that followed the attack, the only sound louder than the gushing water tower was the frantic beating of Marshal Harding's own heart. He knew the quiet was a tactic, a form of psychological torture designed to let the terror sink in. The hunters on the ridge were giving the town time to stew in its own fear, time to contemplate the offer their violence had implied. Give us the man, and the pain will stop. Harding knew he had to act, to impose some semblance of order on the chaos, before the town's fear curdled into a panicked, self-serving decision. He moved to the splintered doorway of his office, keeping low. "Cole! Finch!" he yelled, his voice raw. "Get over here, on the double. We need to organize a defense." From the deep shadows of the blacksmith shop, Cole's voice came back, thin and shaky, all its earlier bravado gone. "And get our heads blown off? Stay put, Marshal. Don't you draw their fire." Finch, still huddled behind the horse trough, didn't even bother to answer. He just whimpered. Harding stared out at the street, at the cowering figures of the very men who had been so eager to form a lynch mob. They were brave only when the odds were overwhelmingly in their favor, when their target was a single, unarmed man. Faced with a real threat, an enemy who shot back, their courage dissolved into abject cowardice. Disgust and desperation warred within him. He was a shepherd whose flock had turned out to be sheep in all the worst ways, and the wolves were not just at the door, but looking down from above. He backed away from the door, defeated. He slumped into his chair, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. His eyes fell on the wanted poster, its bold letters now seeming like a cruel joke. Wanted. Silas Kane. Then his gaze lifted to the man himself, standing silently in the cell. Silas hadn't said a word during Harding's failed attempt to rally the town. He hadn't mocked him. His expression was one of grim, knowing empathy. He had seen men break before. In that moment, the choice became horribly, undeniably clear. He could rely on the frightened shopkeepers who would get everyone killed, or he could take the greatest risk of his life. He could trust the one man in town who understood the nature of the enemy. He could trust the monster on the poster to save them from the monsters on the ridge. It was a choice between the letter of the law, which demanded Silas remain in chains, and the spirit of it, which demanded he protect the lives of his citizens by any means necessary. With a resolve born of pure desperation, Harding stood up. He walked to the wall where the keys hung on a hook. He took down the heavy iron key to the cells, its metal cold and final in his palm. He walked to Silas's cell, the sound of his own boots on the floorboards echoing the finality of his decision. Silas watched him approach, his expression unreadable, cautious. The key slid into the lock. The tumblers turned with a loud, grating clank. Harding pulled the heavy steel door open. The sound echoed in the small building, a point of no return. Silas did not move. He simply watched, waiting. Harding returned to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a spare Colt revolver and a gun belt, laying them on the scarred wood. Next to them, he placed a simple tin star, a deputy's badge, unadorned and functional. "I'm not setting you free, Kane," Harding said, his voice low and steady, belying the storm in his soul. "Under the authority vested in me as a U.S. Marshal in this territory, I am enacting a field deputization. I am ordering you to assist in the defense of this town." It was a desperate gambit, a radical use of the posse comitatus principle, but it was the only move he had left to play. Silas looked from the marshal's hardened face to the gun and the badge on the desk. He stepped out of the open cell, the first taste of freedom in a day, but he made no move toward the items. He was weighing the offer, seeing every sharp and deadly edge. "This badge," Silas said, his voice quiet, "won't stop a bullet from those men on the ridge, Marshal. And it won't stop a rope from your townspeople when this is over." He was not a fool. He understood the temporary, fragile nature of this alliance. He knew that as soon as the external threat was gone, he would revert from savior back to scapegoat. "Maybe not," Harding admitted, his honesty brutal. "But you'll be alive to worry about it, which is more than I can say for either of us if those men have their way. They're coming for you, and they'll burn this town to the ground as an afterthought." He slid the gun belt across the desk. "One fight at a time, Kane. That's the only promise I can make you." For a long moment, Silas stood there, the free man and the lawman locked in a silent negotiation. The fate of the entire town rested on his decision. He looked at the gun, a tool of violence he had come to hate. He looked at the badge, a symbol of a law that had condemned him without a trial. Then he looked at Harding, a man forced to break his own code to uphold it. With a slow, deliberate motion, Silas reached out and picked up the gun belt. He strapped it around his waist, the weight of the Colt familiar and unwelcome. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he picked up the tin star. He didn't pin it to his shirt. He simply held it in his palm, its edges digging into his skin. A cold, hard contract. The outlaw was now the law. The moment the tin star touched Silas's palm, the dynamic in the room shifted irrevocably. The quiet, passive prisoner vanished, replaced by a man of startling and immediate purpose. He didn't holster the Colt right away. He hefted it, checked the action, spun the cylinder, his movements economical and certain. Then he turned, not to thank the marshal or to savor his freedom, but to take charge. His first act was to stride to Harding's desk, pick up the brass spyglass, and return to the relative safety of the window's edge. For a full minute, he did nothing but watch the ridge, his body utterly still, his eyes scanning the terrain with an intensity that made it clear he was not just looking, but reading the landscape. Harding watched, astonished. He had deputized a prisoner out of sheer desperation, expecting a hesitant ally at best. What he got was a field commander. "Two of them," Silas said finally, his voice low and devoid of any emotion but grim analysis. He was speaking more to himself than to the marshal. "One is the spotter, positioned higher up. The other is the shooter, about 50 yards to his left, nestled in that V-shaped cleft in the rock. Perfect cover, perfect sightline. They're professionals, all right." He lowered the spyglass and turned to Harding, his gray eyes now sharp and focused. "We can't fight them from here, Marshal. Not a long-range duel. They'll pick us off one by one. Our only chance is to make them come down. We have to turn this street into a death trap." Before Harding could even process the words, Silas was in motion. He was no longer Silas Kane, the quiet drifter. He was a hidden genius of tactics, his mind working with a terrifying clarity. He strode to the splintered door of the office. "Cole!" he bellowed, his voice a commander's bark that was a world away from the quiet swamper of the day before. "Get back from that door! Finch, you too! Listen to me, both of you!" The sheer authority in his voice seemed to stun them into obedience. "We need barricades," Silas continued, pointing. "Cole, that heavy wagon of yours, I need it dragged across the street, parallel to the buildings, not to block the road, but to create a channel, a firing lane. Finch, get your poker tables from the saloon. Turn them on their sides. We build a secondary line of defense right here." He was orchestrating the town's defense with an uncanny knowledge of his enemy. It was clear he had seen this all before. He wasn't just reacting to the threat. He was anticipating their moves, using their own tactical mindset against them. His strategies were drawn from the brutal lessons of the Civil War, where sieges turned towns into intricate puzzles of death. He saw Cole hesitate, the blacksmith's pride warring with his fear. Silas strode out into the open for a brief moment, ignoring the immense risk, and stood before the blacksmith's shop. "Cole," he snapped, "they want us divided and hiding. Every second we wait, they win. Are you going to let your town die, or are you going to fight?" He then pointed to a stack of iron rods by the forge. "And once that wagon is moved, fire up your forge. I need caltrops, dozens of them, thrown in the dust on the far side of the barricade. They'll try a mounted charge at dusk, using the low light. Their horses will be crippled before they get within 50 yards. Cole stared, his mouth agape. Caltrops, a medieval weapon, but brutally effective. The idea was so cunning, so outside the realm of a typical frontier gunfight, that it shocked him into action. With a grunt, he began to rally a few other men, their fear of the snipers now marginally overcome by the fear of this strange, commanding drifter. Silas's eyes swept the street, and he saw Ilara directing people toward the relative safety of the stone-walled livery. He gave her a sharp, respectful nod. He recognized an ally, a fellow island of competence in a sea of panic. He then turned to Harding, who had been following his orders, helping to move a table into place, feeling more like the deputy than the marshal. "Where in God's name did you learn all this?" Harding asked, breathing heavily. Silas paused his work, his gaze distant for a moment, as if looking back across 2 decades. "I spent the better part of 4 years with the Union Army," he said, his voice flat. mostly learning how to take fortified positions from men who were just as scared and stubborn as we are now. Vicksburg, Petersburg. You learn a lot about the geometry of a firefight when your life depends on it. The confession hung in the air. His genius wasn't born of a criminal mind, but forged in the crucible of the nation's bloodiest conflict. He was using the tactics of a soldier to save a town that had branded him an outlaw. The irony was as thick as the dust in the air, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows down the street. The town of Sovereign's Jaw was transformed. It was no longer a collection of vulnerable wooden storefronts. It was a fortress. Barricades channeled the main street into a narrow kill zone. Firing positions were established in the livery's hayloft and the blacksmith's forge. The entire town was now a weapon, cocked and waiting. And the townsfolk, who had scorned the man in the tattered coat, now looked for his orders, their faces a mixture of terror and a new, grudging, and deeply unsettling awe. As twilight bled across the sky, a fragile, temporary peace settled over Sovereign's Jaw. The hunters on the ridge were silent, likely waiting for the deep cover of night for their next move. The wind whispered through the new, makeshift barricades, carrying the scent of splintered pine and dust. Silas moved through the gloom like a phantom, checking the defensive positions he had designed. His presence, a strange mixture of menace and reassurance for the terrified men he posted as lookouts. He spoke to them in low, direct tones, offering corrections on their sightlines and reminding them to listen more than they watched. He was a general inspecting his troops that consisted of a handful of frightened merchants and a blacksmith, all of them armed with a new and unsettling respect for the man they had scorned. His patrol eventually led him to the livery stable. The large open space had been transformed into a sanctuary, a makeshift shelter for the women, children, and men too old or too scared to fight. The air inside was thick with the smells of hay, animals, and human fear. Families were huddled together on blankets, their faces pale in the flickering lantern light. Jeb, the livery owner, moved among them, offering water from a bucket, his earlier bluster replaced by a quiet, somber sense of duty. In a corner, a space had been cleared for Alara. With a clean burning lantern hung from a beam above, she had established a small infirmary. She was the picture of calm competence amidst the quiet panic. As Silas approached, he saw her carefully cleaning a cut on a young boy's arm, the child having scraped it during the initial scramble for cover. She was using a diluted carbolic acid solution, an antiseptic technique she'd read about in medical journals from back east. The sharp, clean scent of the acid was a stark contrast to the stable's earthy smells. It was the scent of progress, of a disciplined mind fighting against the chaos. Silas waited until she had finished bandaging the boy's arm and sent him back to his mother with a reassuring word. He approached her quietly, his spurs making no sound in the thick hay on the floor. "Doctor," he said, his voice low. Alara looked up, her expression weary but resolute. "Mr. Kane, are you injured?" "No," he shook his head. "I'm checking our resources. How are we for water, now that the tower's gone?" "The well pump is still working. Jeb is rationing it," she answered, appreciating his tactical focus. "We have some food from the general store, but what we don't have is a lot of ammunition, do we?" He met her gaze. She was as much a realist as he was. "No," he admitted. "We have enough for one good fight. After that..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their predicament hanging between them. Then Alara put down her roll of bandages, her gaze searching his face. "I have to ask," she said, her voice dropping so only he could hear. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe this town a thing. They treated you worse than a stray dog. They were ready to hand you over to that mob for the money. Why risk your life for them? It was the question that lay at the heart of the entire affair. He was a wanted man, a man whose freedom and life were forfeit. He had no logical reason to fight for a people who had shown him nothing but contempt. He could have used the chaos to try and escape, to slip away into the darkness. Silas's gaze drifted from her face to the huddled families across the stable. He saw the children clinging to their mothers, the old men with their vacant, frightened eyes. His expression was distant, haunted. "A long time ago," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I was part of something that tore people's lives apart. I told myself it was for a good reason, but I was wrong. I stood by while a man I trusted chose greed over honor." He paused, the memory of Thorne's betrayal a visible shadow in his eyes. "That man told me that a conscience was a weakness, that honor was just a weight that holds a man down and keeps him from getting what he wants." He finally turned his gaze back to Alara, and she saw in his eyes not the coldness of a killer, but the deep, aching sorrow of a man who had lost his way and was desperately trying to find it again. "I suppose," Silas concluded, "I'm fighting because I have to know if he was right. When you stand on the wrong side of things once, Doctor, you feel a powerful need to stand on the right side the next time you get the chance, even if it's the last chance you get." The confession was a revelation. His actions weren't about survival or strategy alone. They were about redemption. It was an attempt to reclaim the piece of his soul that Elias Thorne had tried to kill in that canyon. Alara's belief in him, which had started as a hunch and grown with observation, now solidified into absolute certainty. She was looking at a man of profound, if battered, honor. "For what it's worth, Mr. Kane," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't believe he was right at all." A sudden shout from a lookout at the front of the livery shattered the moment. The lull was over. Silas gave Alara one last, grateful look, then turned and melted back into the shadows, his face once again the hard mask of a soldier heading into battle. The first sign of the second attack was not a sound, but a streak of light. A single, flaming arrow, launched from the darkness of the ridge, drew a terrifying orange arc against the star-dusted sky. It flew with a malevolent grace before thudding deep into the dry timber roof of Cole's blacksmith shop, one of their two strongest defensive positions. For a moment, it just sat there, a burning javelin of pure menace. Then, with a soft whoosh, the dry wood ignited. Flames began to lick at the shingles, hungry and fast. The hunters were escalating their tactics. This wasn't just about pinning them down anymore. It was about flushing them out, about using the primal fear of fire to break their carefully constructed defenses. Panic erupted inside the forge. Cole and two other men were trapped, caught between the rapidly spreading fire above and the expert marksman on the ridge. "We're cooked! We have to make a run for it!" one of the men screamed, his eyes wide with terror as smoke began to fill the smithy. "Stay put!" Cole roared, his voice a bellow of newfound authority born from a terror greater than his own pride. He was coughing, his eyes watering from the smoke, but in that moment of crisis, Silas's instructions became his gospel. He said to hold this position, trust the plan. For the first time, Cole wasn't just a blacksmith. He was a soldier holding a vital part of the line. His baptism by fire was literal. While the men in the forge battled their fear, Silas saw the enemy's move not as a crisis, but as a fatal error. From his vantage point near the main barricade, he watched the flames grow, illuminating the street in a ghastly, dancing light. "He's made a mistake, Marshal," Silas said to Harding, who was positioned nearby. His voice was laced with a cold, predatory calm. "He thinks the fire is his weapon, but he just gave us a gift." The brilliant orange glow of the burning building served as a massive backlight, silhouetting the shooter on the ridge who had, until now, been invisible. He was a perfect black cutout against a wall of fire. "Harding now!" Silas commanded. "The shooter on the left. You have a clear shot." Harding lifted his rifle, the stock firm against his shoulder. He finally had a target. He took a steadying breath, let it out halfway, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked, its report sharp and clean. He didn't hit the man, but the bullet whined off the rock inches from his head, forcing the sniper to duck back into cover. For the first time since the siege began, the town was effectively fighting back. A ragged cheer went up from the few men who saw it. Seeing his partner pinned down and their plan unraveling, the second hunter, the spotter, made a desperate, aggressive move. He spurred his horse down a steep side path of the ridge, charging toward the town. His intent was clear: to ride through their weakened flank, guns blazing, and create enough chaos for his partner to re-establish dominance. He galloped out of the darkness, a wraith on a black horse, confident that all eyes were on the fire. He was wrong. He charged headlong into the trap Silas had laid. As his horse hit the patch of dark, churned-up earth just beyond the barricades, it let out a piercing, unholy scream of agony. The caltrops, those vicious iron stars forged by Cole just hours before, did their brutal work. The horse's front legs buckled as the spikes tore through its hooves, and it went down in a catastrophic, tumbling heap. The rider was thrown clear, landing hard with a sickening crunch. The night was filled with the horse's agonized screams. The thrown hunter, his arm clearly broken, scrambled for cover, firing his pistol wildly into the town as he retreated into the darkness. From the ridge, the first sniper laid down a desperate volley of covering fire, forcing the defenders to keep their heads down, while his wounded partner dragged himself away. Then, as quickly as it began, the assault was over. Silence descended once more, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the awful, dying gasps of the hunter's horse. The townspeople rushed from their shelters, forming a bucket brigade from the well pump to the forge, their earlier fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline and a desperate will to save what they could. They worked together, a chaotic but unified force, and slowly, painstakingly, they brought the fire under control. When it was over, they stood exhausted, smoke-stained, and battered. The forge was a blackened, steaming ruin. Their ammunition was significantly depleted, but they had held. They had won. Cole, the blacksmith, his face covered in soot and his hands blistered from a burning beam he had moved, walked through the tired crowd until he stood before Silas. The entire town watched. This was the man who had led the chorus of scorn, the man who had judged Silas most harshly. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer an apology. He just looked Silas square in the eye, the firelight reflecting in his weary gaze. "The caltrops," Cole said, his voice raspy from smoke. That was smart. It was a simple statement, but it was a surrender. It was an admission of respect, earned not with words, but with fire and blood and tactics. In that moment, the town's perception of Silas Kane shifted for good. He was no longer the drifter, the outlaw, or even the deputy. He was their defender, and they all knew with a chilling certainty that this fragile victory had come at a price, and the final bill had not yet been paid. Dawn broke on a landscape of wreckage and exhaustion. The air in Sovereign's jaw was acrid with the smell of burnt timber and dread. The citizens, nursing their wounded pride and their very real losses, moved about like ghosts, patching up the newly made holes in their lives. The forge was a blackened skeleton. The street was littered with debris, and the dead horse of the attacker lay covered by a canvas sheet, a grim monument to their costly victory. Yet underneath the fear, A fragile new spirit had taken root. They had faced a professional enemy and held the line. They had found a leader in the most unlikely of men. It was this fragile sense of resolve that made the sight of the lone rider all the more unsettling. He appeared with the morning sun, not on the high ridges where the hunters had perched, but on the main trail, riding toward the town with an unhurried, almost regal confidence. He was not one of the hunters. He rode a magnificent black stallion with a gleaming coat, a stark contrast to the trail-worn mustangs of the territory. This was not the approach of an attacker. It was the arrival of a conqueror. As he drew closer, the details of his appearance sent a fresh wave of confusion and fear through the onlookers peering from behind their barricades. This was no dusty outlaw. He wore a fine, dark frock coat tailored to his broad shoulders, clean trousers, and riding boots polished to a high sheen. His face was clean-shaven, handsome in a sharp, predatory way, and he sat upon a silver-inlaid saddle that was likely worth more than most of the town's businesses. He was the devil in fine clothes, an embodiment of a different kind of power, the power of wealth and influence, which was often far more ruthless than a gun. He reined in his horse 100 yards from the main barricade, just outside of effective pistol range, but close enough for his voice to carry. He made no move for a weapon. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced a white silk handkerchief, which he calmly tied to the end of a riding crop. He held it up, a flag of truce, a gesture of civility that felt like the most profound mockery. From behind the barricade of Cole's wagon, Silas watched the man, and all the air went out of his lungs. The calm, calculating tactician of the previous night vanished, consumed by a cold, silent rage that was terrifying in its intensity. The wounds of the past, the betrayal, the bullet in his side, the month spent running, were ripped open anew. His hand tightened on his rifle, his knuckles turning white. "Silas," Marshal Harding said, sensing the shift. He put a restraining hand on Silas's arm. "Stay calm." "It's him," Silas breathed, his voice a low, guttural sound. "Thorn!" The name meant nothing to Harding, but the venom with which it was spoken told him everything. This was the architect of ruin, the ghost from Silas's past, now made flesh. Elias Thorne's voice rang out, as smooth and polished as his boots. It was an educated voice, full of easy charisma and utterly devoid of the frontier's rough edges. "Good morning, people of Sovereign's Jaw," he called out, his tone pleasant, as if he were addressing a town meeting. "My name is Elias Thorne. My apologies for the disturbance last night. It seems my associates were a bit overzealous in their duties." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. He was distancing himself from the violence, while simultaneously taking credit for commanding it. "I am here to rectify the situation and see that no one else gets hurt," Thorne continued, his gaze sweeping over their defenses with an appraising, almost amused look. He addressed his next words to Marshal Harding, shrewdly identifying him as the man in charge. "Marshal, I believe you are holding a fugitive from federal justice, a man named Silas Kane. He is a dangerous murderer and a thief. I have been tracking him for months on behalf of the authorities. He was framing himself as the voice of law and order, a private citizen working in concert with the government. He was trying to undo everything Silas had accomplished, to repaint him as the villain. Simply hand him over to me," Thorne projected, his voice a balm of sweet reason. "Do that, and this ordeal is over. The men on the ridge will withdraw. I will personally see to it that this town is generously compensated by my employers for the damages incurred and for your cooperation." It was a masterful temptation. He wasn't threatening them with more violence. He was offering them exactly what they craved: peace, safety, and money. He was offering them a clean, simple solution to a bloody, complex problem. All they had to do was betray the one man who had saved them. Silas stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury, his rifle held loosely at his side. "Don't listen to him, Marshal. He's the murderer. He's the one who betrayed me." Thorne's charming smile didn't waver. He simply focused on Silas, a look of faux pity in his eyes. "Ah, Silas. Still telling your sad stories. Can you blame him, Marshal? A cornered animal will say anything to survive." Hitati turned his attention back to the town at large, his voice resonating with power and finality. "The choice is yours. A peaceful morning and a handsome reward, or another night of fire and blood. I'll give you 1 hour to make the sensible decision." With that, he lowered his white flag, turned his magnificent horse with practiced ease, and trotted back the way he came, leaving his ultimatum hanging in the air like a death shroud. He hadn't fired a single shot, but his words were more dangerous than any bullet. He had aimed directly at the fractured soul of the town itself. Elias Thorne's words lingered in the morning air long after he was gone, a poison that began to seep into the fragile unity of the town. His offer was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, bypassing their barricades and striking directly at their deepest fears and most desperate desires. He gave them an enemy to blame, Silas, and a savior to look to, himself. The townspeople looked at one another, their faces etched with doubt. They looked at the blackened shell of the forge, at the bullet-pocked walls of their homes, and the memory of the previous night's terror came flooding back, chilling the warmth of their victory. Finch, the cattle buyer, was the first to give voice to the poison. He wiped his sweaty brow with a trembling hand, his bravado replaced by a mask of pragmatic concern. "We should think about this," he said, his voice aimed at the crowd of exhausted citizens gathering in the street. "The man has a point. Look at us. Our water tower is crippled. The forge is gone. How long can we last? He's offering us a way out." He didn't say the words betrayal or surrender. He used the language of business, of practicality. "He mentioned compensation," Finch pressed on, his voice growing stronger as he saw nods of agreement among some of the merchants. "Money to rebuild. After the lean years we've had, with the depression hitting everyone so hard, can we afford to say no? This isn't our fight." The argument was potent. It appealed to their exhaustion, their desire for normalcy, and their greed. For men and women who had endured the economic hardships of the last decade, the promise of security and wealth was a powerful siren song. But Cole, the blacksmith, his face still streaked with soot, his hands raw, stepped forward to face Finch. The fire had burned the cowardice out of him. "It is our fight now, Finch," he growled, his voice a low rumble of conviction. "It became our fight when that man," he jutted his chin toward Silas, who stood silently beside the marshal, "taught us how to have one. You want to take money from that snake on the horse? It's blood money, and it will buy us nothing but shame." The town was now split, the fault line running straight through its heart. "Cole's right about the man, but Finch is right about the risk," shouted the general store owner, gesturing to his shattered storefront. "I have a family. My business is in ruins. We can't all be martyrs." A woman began to weep. "What about our children? Must they die for the sake of one man's honor?" The debate grew louder, more frantic. The unity forged in the heat of battle was dissolving into a chaotic scramble for self-preservation. Each person weighed their own potential losses against a principle that was becoming more abstract by the second. They were reenacting the age-old story of Judas, calculating the price of a man's life, convincing themselves that their betrayal was not an act of weakness, but a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. Throughout it all, Silas remained silent. He stood beside Harding, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He did not plead his case or defend himself. He simply watched the town he had saved tear itself apart, his expression grim with a terrible, knowing disappointment. He was letting them choose who they were. Marshal Harding raised his hands, trying to impose order. "That's enough. Thorne is playing you against each other, and you're falling for it. Hook, line, and sinker. There is no honor in dealing with a man like that. We stand together, or we fall together." His words were true, but they were drowned out by the rising tide of fear. It was Alara who turned it. She stepped out from the crowd, her face resolute, her voice clear and cutting, silencing the cacophony. "Shame on you, Henry Finch," she said, her eyes boring into the cattle buyer. "And shame on anyone else here who is letting their fear speak louder than their conscience." She did not shout. Her quiet authority commanded their attention more effectively than any roar. "Just last night," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, "you were following this man's orders. You were hiding behind the barricades he designed. You were alive because of his courage and his mind. Has your memory failed you so quickly? Or is your honor just for sale to the highest bidder?" She pointed a finger toward the livery. "Mr. Kane fought to protect the very children you claim to be worried about. He showed more compassion for a lame horse than some of you are showing for him right now. We all saw the men on that ridge. They are killers. Thorne is their master. Do you truly believe such a man will honor his word? He will take Mitikwa under Kane, and then he will burn this town to the ground to erase any witnesses to his crime. Our survival is tied to our integrity. The moment we sacrifice one for the other, we will lose them both." Her words fell like stones into the pool of their fear, the ripples of truth silencing their arguments. The townsfolk looked down at their feet, unable to meet her gaze. She had held up a mirror, and they were ashamed of the reflection. The silence was broken by Cole. He walked over to stand near the marshal, turning his back on Finch and the other doubters. "The doctor is right," he said, his voice firm. "We stand with the marshal, and we stand with Kane." One by one, other men, ashamed of their momentary weakness, nodded in agreement and moved to join him. The debate was over. The town had been tested, and after a moment of terrible wavering, its soul had held. Silas watched it all, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than weariness, perhaps surprise, perhaps even a sliver of hope, appeared in his eyes. He wasn't alone anymore. The hour Thorne had allotted them was up. The silence that fell over Sovereign's jaw was no longer a tense truce. It was a judgment. The sun climbed higher, baking the dusty street, and the grim faces of the men and women crouched behind their makeshift fortifications. They had made their choice. They had chosen honor over the illusion of safety. Now, they would pay the price. From his position at the central barricade, Silas watched the ridges, his face calm, but his eyes holding the ancient, weary look of a man who knew intimately the prelude to battle. The attack, when it came, was not a simple charge. It was a coordinated, multi-pronged assault designed to shatter their defenses through overwhelming force. A signal shot rang out from the ridge, and simultaneously, gunfire erupted from 3 directions. Thorne's 2 hunters were back in their perch, laying down a terrifying barrage of suppressing fire on the main street. At the same time, 3 more of Thorne's hired guns, who had circled around under the cover of the valley's folds, launched a flanking assault on the town's weaker western edge, directly toward the livery stable where the non-combatants were sheltered. Thorne was not just trying to kill Silas, he was trying to annihilate the town's will to fight. But he had not counted on the town's new commander. "Hold your fire!" Silas's voice cut through the rising panic, a blade of pure command. "Don't waste a shot. Wait for my signal." He had anticipated a flanking maneuver. The townspeople, now his disciplined, if terrified militia, obeyed. They hunkered down, the bullets of the hunters chipping away at their cover, their knuckles white on their rifles. But they did not fire. "Cole!" Silas bellowed toward the livery. "They're coming for you. Bar the door and hold that line. Do not let them through." Inside the stable, Cole, no longer a blacksmith but a veritable bear of a man, slammed a heavy crossbar into place, his heart pounding with a terror that was almost exhilarating. He and 3 other men took up positions at the reinforced windows, their fear for the families behind them overriding their fear of the men outside. The flanking attackers, expecting to rush into a scene of chaos, were met with a surprising silence. They charged forward, breaking from cover, and ran directly into the firing lane Silas had anticipated. "Harding now!" Silas yelled. "West side attackers! 3-shot volley! Ready! Aim! Fire!" Harding and 2 other men, acting as a single unit as Silas had drilled them, rose from behind their barricade and unleashed a coordinated volley of fire. The sudden, concentrated fusillade caught the attackers completely by surprise. One of them screamed and went down, clutching his leg. The other 2 dove for cover, their charge completely broken. It was a textbook military tactic, a world away from a chaotic frontier shootout, and it was devastatingly effective. But the fight was far from over. On the main street, the suppressing fire from the ridge was relentless. One of Thorne's men, a wiry gunslinger, managed to breach a weak spot in the line near the general store. He rolled over a poker table barricade and came up shooting, nearly hitting the store owner. Finch, the cattle buyer, who Silas had assigned the demeaning but vital job of a reloader, was huddled nearby. Fumbling with cartridges, his face a mask of pure terror, the gunslinger advanced on their position, a cruel smirk on his face. Harding was pinned down, Silas too far away to intervene. In that moment of absolute panic, with the killer's pistol swinging toward him, Finch did the only thing his terrified mind could conceive of. He didn't shoot. He screamed and swung the heavy rifle he was loading like a club. The solid wood stock connected with the side of the gunslinger's head with a sickening crack. The man dropped like a stone, unconscious. Finch stared at the crumpled body, then at the rifle in his hands, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had acted. The coward had landed a blow. The battle raged, a chaotic symphony of gunfire, shouting, and the splintering of wood. The town of Sovereign's Jaw, once a quiet backwater, had become its own Alamo, a dusty, desperate bastion of defiance. Led by the marshal and inspired by the outlaw, they fought with the ferocity of a people who had rediscovered their own soul. They were no longer fighting for Silas Kane. They were fighting for themselves, for the right to call themselves honorable men. Seeing his hired professionals being held at bay by a town of shopkeepers, Elias Thorne's aristocratic composure finally shattered. His face contorted in a mask of pure fury. This was not just a loose end anymore, it was an insult. He spurred his black stallion forward, riding into the edge of the battle. He was not a frontline brawler, but a commander, staying behind the main thrust of his men, using his own expert marksmanship to tip the scales. He ignored the others. His eyes, cold and full of murderous rage, searched for only one man. Through the smoke and the chaos, he saw him. Silas, moving from position to position, directing fire, a leader in his element. Thorne raised his own silver-plated revolver, taking careful aim. The larger battle for the town was now focusing, like a magnifying glass in the sun, on the 2 men who had started it all in a dusty canyon half a year ago. The final reckoning was at hand. All at once, the cacophony of the larger battle seemed to fade. The shouting, the gunfire, the screams, they all receded into a dull roar, a distant backdrop to the single, searing point of focus that had emerged from the chaos. Across the smoky, sun-drenched street, Silas and Elias Thorne locked eyes. The fight for Sovereign's jaw had ended. The war that began in a bloody canyon 6 months ago was about to have its final, bitter reckoning. Thorne, enraged at being unhorsed and forced to fight on common ground, fired his silver-plated revolver, the shot gouging a deep splinter from the wagon barricade near Silas's head. The move forced Silas from his command post, drawing him into the open. The duel had begun, not as a formal affair of honor at high noon, but as a messy, desperate scramble amidst the ruins of their own making. "You should have stayed a ghost, Silas," Thorne screamed as he ducked behind the corner of the general store, his aristocratic voice now a raw, ugly snarl. "You were more useful as a legend on a wanted poster." Silas didn't answer with words. He answered with tactics. He moved fluidly through the defenses he had designed, using the angles and channels to his advantage. He was no longer the town's commander. He was a hunter, stalking the man who had stolen his life. He fired a single, deliberate shot, not at Thorne, but at the large glass window of the store Thorne was hiding behind. The window exploded into 1,000 pieces, showering Thorne with glass and forcing him to abandon his cover. "You shot those men, Elias!" Silas's voice rang out, clear and damning for all the town to hear. "Those guards had surrendered! You murdered them!" "I built a legacy!" Thorne shrieked back, firing wildly as he ran for new cover near the horse trough where Finch had once cowered. "And you were the perfect foundation. A tragic villain for the story. Why couldn't you just die with dignity?" The townspeople, crouched behind their own positions, listened to the exchange. The last shreds of ambiguity were incinerated in the fire of Thorne's own confession. They were hearing the truth, raw and unfiltered, from the mouths of the men who had lived it. The gunfight was a brutal dance of tactics and hatred. Thorne was fast, flashy, and fueled by pure narcissistic rage. Silas was methodical, patient, and fueled by a cold, righteous fury. He anticipated Thorne's movements, countering his aggressive pushes with disciplined, tactical retreats, always channeling him, always forcing him into the less defensible position. Finally, they faced each other in the open space before the blackened ruin of the forge. Both men were breathing heavily, their guns nearly empty. Thorne, seeing he could not win a straightforward fight against the superior tactician, resorted to the one thing he had always mastered: deceit. He clutched his side, a pained grimace on his face, and staggered. "All right, Silas, you win," he gasped, throwing his revolver into the dust. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I yield." For a split second, Silas hesitated. His finger eased on the trigger. He had won. It was over. It was the moment Thorne had been waiting for. In a move of shocking speed, the classic dishonorable road agent spin, Thorne dropped his hands, spinning and drawing a smaller, hidden pistol from the small of his back. But Silas knew this man. He knew his soul was as empty as his promises. As Thorne's second gun came up, Silas's Colt was already bucking in his hand. He had not fallen for the feint. He had anticipated the betrayal. The shot was not aimed at Thorne's heart. It was not aimed at his head. Silas's bullet struck with surgical precision, hitting Thorne squarely in the right shoulder. The impact shattered the bone, and Thorne's second pistol flew from his nerveless grasp. He let out a scream that was not of a fearsome villain, but of a common man in excruciating pain, and collapsed into the dust, clutching his ruined arm. The battle was over. Thorne's remaining men, seeing their leader fall, lost all courage. One threw down his rifle and surrendered to Cole, while the others fled into the hills. A deafening silence fell over the street, broken only by Thorne's pathetic whimpering. Silas walked slowly, deliberately, until he stood over the man who had destroyed his world. The hatred in Silas's face was a terrible thing to behold. He raised his Colt, the barrel shaking slightly, and aimed it directly at Thorne's forehead. The town watched, breathless. This was the moment of justice, the moment of vengeance. "Don't do it, Kane!" Marshal Harding yelled, his voice echoing in the sudden stillness. "Don't become him. Let the law have him." Silas looked down at Thorne, a man stripped of his fine clothes, his charisma, his power, now just a wounded animal snarling in the dirt. He saw the man who had left him to die. Then he looked at his own hand, holding the gun. He thought of the badge Alara had inspired him to uphold, the trust the town had placed in him. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered the pistol. He had not just won the fight. He had won the war within himself. He would not be the killer Elias Thorne had tried to make him. The dust of the final battle settled, mingling with the smoke and the long shadows of the late afternoon. There was no cheer of victory. The people of Sovereign's jaw emerged from their shelters, not with triumph, but with the somber, weary relief of survivors. They looked at the wreckage of their street, at the bodies of the fallen, and then they looked at Silas. He stood alone in the center of the chaos, his borrowed deputy star still clutched in his hand, a figure who no longer fit any category they had ever known. He was not the drifter, not the outlaw, not the hero. He was simply the man who had stood when everyone else had run. Cole the blacksmith approached him first. He didn't offer praise or thanks. He simply held out his canteen. "Water," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. Silas took it and drank, a silent communion that spoke more than words. From across the street, Finch, his face a mess of shame and gratitude, began sweeping the shattered glass from his porch, giving Silas a slow, respectful nod. The town's scorn had been replaced by a debt that could never be repaid. It was an hour later when the real law arrived. A new dust cloud appeared on the horizon, and from it emerged a U.S. Marshal, flanked by a posse of 6 uniformed deputies. They rode in with stern, official purpose, their horses fresh, their guns clean. They were an image of the authority that was supposed to protect places like this, arriving, as it so often did, long after the battle had been fought and won by those it had abandoned. The federal marshal, a man named Croft with a hard, uncompromising face, took in the scene of carnage with stunned disbelief. He saw the captured, wounded men, the smoldering forge, and Elias Thorne, bound tightly to a chair, his face a mask of pain and impotent fury. Croft dismounted, his eyes scanning the faces until they landed on Silas. He pulled a familiar, folded poster from his coat. "The poster. I'm here for him," Croft said, his voice carrying the full weight of federal law. "Silas Kane, wanted for murder and robbery." Before Silas could even react, Marshal Harding stepped forward, positioning himself between Croft and his former prisoner. "Marshal Croft," Harding began, his voice steady. "You'll want to hear the whole story before you make any pronouncements. This poster, it's a lie." Croft's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "That's a serious accusation, Marshal. It's a serious truth," Harding replied. And then he told him everything. As he spoke, the townspeople gathered around, no longer a mob, but a collection of witnesses. Cole stepped up and described the tactics Silas used to save them. Jeb, the livery owner, told of his kindness to the horse. Even Finch mumbled his own shame-faced account of being saved by the man he'd wanted to betray. The entire town, once his jury of mockers, had become his staunchest defense, but it was Alara who sealed it. She presented Thorne's wounded hired gun, whom she had been treating, and revealed that the man delirious with pain, had confessed everything. That Thorne was the leader, the killer, and that their job was to silence Silas Kane for good. Faced with the unified testimony of an entire town, a fellow lawman, and a deathbed confession, Marshall Croft's rigid certainty began to crumble. He looked from the snarling, wealthy man in the chair to the quiet, dignified man in the tattered greatcoat. The law was about facts, and the facts on the ground violently contradicted the facts on his poster. He made his decision. "Elias Thorne," Croft declared, his voice booming. "You and your men are under arrest for the robbery of the Rock Island line, for the murder of its guards, and for a conspiracy to kill a federal witness." He then turned to Silas. "As for you, Mr. Kane, given the testimony of these people, you're a free man. You're cleared of all charges. Freedom." It was a word Silas hadn't dared to even think for months. It felt foreign, a garment that no longer fit. While the marshal secured Thorne and his men, preparing them for the long ride to a federal court, Silas slipped away from the commotion. He found his way back to the livery, back to the quiet world of hay and horses. He was standing with the sorrel mare, gently examining her leg, when Alara found him. "You're free, Silas," she said softly, standing beside him in the quiet dusk. "No more running." He nodded, but his eyes were on the open plains, visible through the wide stable doors, now painted purple and orange by the setting sun. "This town owes you everything," she continued. "You have a place here. You've earned it." She paused, her courage building. "I have a practice to run, a life to build. I could use a partner, someone who knows how to heal things that are broken." It was an offering of everything he had ever wanted: a home, a purpose, a chance at love. He turned to her, and his eyes were full of a deep, aching sadness. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, a gesture of profound gratitude and farewell. "In another life, Alara," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe I could have been that man." He looked down at his own worn coat, a symbol of all the miles he'd traveled and all the ghosts he carried. Some coats are too old to ever feel clean, and some trails don't have an end. But you've shown me that they can pass through places where good people live, and for that, I will be forever grateful. He was giving her his answer. He was a man forged on the trail, and the habit of wandering, of looking over his shoulder, was a part of his very soul. He might be free from the law, but he was not yet free from himself. He could not stay and risk bringing his past to her doorstep ever again. The wandering hero could save the town, but he could not allow himself to live in it. He left before the sun, just as he had arrived, a ghost on the edge of the light. There was no grand farewell, no promises made or broken. He simply saddled his buckskin horse, which now had more flesh on its bones, took the loaf of bread and jerky Alara had packed for him, and rode east, away from the town he had both terrorized and saved. He left the deputy's badge on the marshal's desk, but he took his old coat, settling its familiar weight over his shoulders like a penance. He was not yet ready to set aside. The story of Silas Kane became woven into the very fabric of Sovereign's jaw. It was told on cold winter nights and hot summer days, a local legend that grew with each telling. They said he was a killer, a saint, a ghost who rode the plains searching for a place to rest his soul. Marshall Harding kept the old wanted poster locked in his desk, a private reminder of the vast, unknowable canyon between the law and the truth. Cole the blacksmith would sometimes stop his hammering and stare out at the plains, remembering the quiet authority of the man who taught him how to fight. And Alara, she would watch the trail, not with the hope of his return, but with the quiet understanding of his departure. She knew that some men are not built for destinations, but for the journey itself. They are shaped by the wind and the dust, their past a constant shadow that even the brightest sun cannot erase. The drifter in the old coat had given Sovereign's job back its honor, but in doing so, had perhaps only confirmed the solitary nature of his own. His name was cleared, but a man is more than a name on a piece of paper. He is the miles he has traveled and the burdens he refuses to set down.